Some questions are never meant to be spoken. They lie buried beneath years of deliberate silence, hidden behind locked doors and destroyed letters. Once voiced, they unravel entire lives, pulling them apart like thread drawn from decaying cloth. In the spring of 1847, at Thornhill Plantation, a young enslaved woman asked such a question. Her name was Denina. She asked it only once, her voice barely a whisper, while standing in the doorway of the plantation house kitchen. The man she asked was the overseer, Horace Vance, a cruel and feared presence on the plantation. 3 days later, Vance was found hanging from an oak tree behind the stables. His own belt was tight around his neck. His face had frozen into an expression witnesses would later describe as one of recognition, as though he finally understood something he had long tried to ignore. But Denina's question did not die with him. It spread through the slave quarters like a sickness, whispered in the tobacco fields, murmured beside cooking fires after dark, and as it spread, other secrets began to surface, secrets that had been carefully guarded for nearly 20 years. These secrets touched the master's family itself. They reached into the bloodlines of the plantation, and at their center was a truth so disturbing that it would eventually consume everyone who came too close to it. This is the story of Thornhill Plantation in Lunenburg County, Virginia, a place where a single question about resemblance became a death sentence, and where the answer revealed a horror far worse than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue, take a moment to consider this. Some truths are so dangerous that even asking about them can seal your fate. Now let us return to that spring morning, to what Denina saw, and why her question could never be answered safely. Thornhill Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of Virginia's rolling Piedmont. Its main house, a 3-story Georgian structure with white columns that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The estate sat on land that had once been hunting grounds for the Saponi people before they were pushed westward by colonial expansion. By 1798, when Colonel James Fairchild purchased the property with money made from the tobacco trade, no trace of the original inhabitants remained, except for the occasional arrowhead turned up by a plow. The plantation had belonged to the Fairchild family for nearly 50 years by the time our story begins. Colonel James had built the main house in 1802, importing craftsmen from Richmond to create a structure that would announce the family's status to anyone who passed. The house featured a grand entrance hall with a curving staircase, parlor on either side with marble fireplaces, a formal dining room that could seat 20, and upstairs, 6 bedrooms with tall windows that overlooked the tobacco fields stretching toward the river. Behind the main house stood the dependencies. The kitchen house built separate to reduce fire risk. The smokehouse where meat was cured. The dairy with its cool stone floor. The laundry where enslaved women spent their days over steaming tubs. The carriage house and stables. The overseer's cottage. And beyond all of these, arranged in 2 rows, the slave quarters, rough wooden cabins with dirt floors and stone chimneys, each housing anywhere from 4 to 8 people. Colonel James Fairchild had died in 1825, leaving the plantation to his son, Edward's father, also named James. This second James Fairchild had run Thornhill for 7 years before dying suddenly in 1832 of what the doctor called apoplexy, a stroke that took him in the middle of the night, leaving him cold in his bed by morning. He was 41 years old, Edward. Fairchild, then just 28, had inherited everything, the land, the house, the debts, and the 47 human beings whose names were listed in the estate inventory between the livestock and the furniture. He had been married for 3 years to Catherine Whitfield, daughter of a Richmond merchant, and they had 1 infant daughter who would die of scarlet fever before her 2nd birthday. By 1847, Edward was 43 years old and looked older. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly gray. His face had the weathered quality of a man who spent his days outdoors inspecting fields and checking accounts. He was not a tall man, perhaps 5 feet 9 inches in, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone conscious of his authority. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in certain lights, and they rarely showed emotion. Catherine had died in 1838. Giving birth to their only surviving child. a boy named Thomas. The birth had been difficult, lasting nearly 2 days, and Catherine had bled too much afterward. The doctor from town had done what he could, but infection set in. She lasted a week, feverish and delirious, calling for her mother and crying about things that made no sense. Edward had sat with her every night, holding her hand, saying nothing. When she finally died, he had her buried in the family cemetery on the hill behind the house beneath a marble stone carved with angels. Thomas was now 9 years old, a thin boy with his father's pale eyes and his mother's delicate features. He was being educated by a tutor from Richmond, a stern Presbyterian named Mr. Gaines, who believed in Latin, mathematics, and the rod. The boy showed aptitude for learning but little enthusiasm. He spent his free hours reading in the library or wandering the grounds, always alone, always quiet. The plantation's enslaved population numbered 47 souls. That spring of 1847, the number fluctuated, births and deaths, occasional sales and purchases, but it had remained close to 50 for the past 15 years. Most worked the tobacco fields that stretched from the main house to the river, their days measured by the sun's arc and the overseer's watch. Tobacco was demanding. It required constant attention from planting in April through harvest in September, and even in winter there was work to be done, stripping leaves, preparing beds for the next year's crop, repairing equipment. Others worked in the house, the stables, the smithy, the kitchen. There was a hierarchy among the enslaved people, as there always was. House servants looked down on field workers. Skilled craftsmen held higher status than common laborers. Those born on the plantation felt superior to those purchased from elsewhere. But these distinctions meant little in the end. They were all property, all subject to the same absolute power, all vulnerable to the same casual cruelties. Dinah was 19 years old that April, born on the plantation to a woman named Ruth, who had died of fever when Dinah was 12. Ruth had worked in the main house as a chambermaid, responsible for cleaning the bedrooms, changing linens, emptying chamber pots, and attending to the personal needs of the family. She had been a quiet woman, Dinah remembered, with sad eyes and gentle hands. She had taught Dinah to read secretly, dangerously, using a Bible she'd somehow acquired, and had told her daughter stories about her own mother, who had been brought from Africa as a child and who remembered the ocean crossing in nightmares that lasted her whole life. Ruth had died in the summer of 1840 during a fever outbreak that killed 6 people on the plantation. Dinah, then 12 years old, had nursed her mother through the final days, wiping her burning forehead with cool cloths, giving her sips of water, listening to her delirious ramblings. In those final hours, Ruth had said things that made no sense to the child Dinah, apologies, warnings, names that meant nothing. She had gripped Dinah's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Dinah hadn't understood then. She understood now. After Ruth's death, Dinah had been moved to the kitchen to work under Bess, an older woman who had cooked for the Fairchilds for 30 years. Bess was perhaps 60 years old. She didn't know exactly, as enslaved people rarely knew their precise ages. With gray hair she kept wrapped in a cloth and hands scarred from decades of burns and cuts. She was the closest thing to a mother Dinah had after Ruth died, teaching her to cook, to manage the kitchen's routines, to navigate the dangerous waters of serving white people who could punish you for any perceived slight. Dinah was quick with her hands, quiet in her manner, and possessed of unusually keen powers of observation, a trait that would prove both gift and curse. She noticed things: the way Edward Fairchild's jaw tightened when he was angry, the way Mr. Gaines's eyes lingered on the younger enslaved women, the way Horace Vance seemed to take pleasure in others' fear. She noticed patterns, connections, resemblances. She had a brother named Samuel, 2 years younger, who worked in the stables. Samuel had been born in the summer of 1830, and from early childhood had been marked by his unusual appearance. While most of the enslaved people at Thornhill bore the deep brown skin common to their West African ancestry, Samuel's complexion was noticeably lighter, what was sometimes called bright in the Parliament of the time, or more crewy, yellow. His features, too, were different. a narrow nose, thin lips, and those same pale gray eyes that marked the Fairchild bloodline. Such things were not uncommon on plantations throughout the South. Everyone knew what they meant, though no one spoke of it directly. Mixed-race children were a visible reminder of the violence and exploitation that undergirded the entire system, and their presence was managed through silence and deliberate ignorance. Masters didn't acknowledge their enslaved children. White wives pretended not to notice, and the enslaved people themselves learned to keep silent because speaking the truth could get you sold away or worse. But Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was more than a matter of coloring. As he grew from boy to young man, the similarity became impossible to ignore. He had Edward's build, tall and lean, with broad shoulders and long limbs. He had Edward's way of tilting his head when listening, as though considering what was being said from multiple angles. He had Edward's long fingers, Edward's straight posture, Edward's habit of rubbing his jaw when thinking. By 1847, at 17 years old, Samuel looked like he could have been Edward's son, which of course he was. Everyone at Thornhill knew it. The enslaved people had known since Samuel was a child, had watched Ruth's shame and silence, had understood the implications. They knew that Ruth had been young and pretty when the old master, Edward's father, had taken notice of her. They knew that she'd had no choice, that no was not a word enslaved women could say to white men. They knew that Samuel was the result, and that Ruth had carried that burden until it killed her. Even the white workers, the overseer, the tutor, the occasional merchants who visited must have noticed. How could they not? Samuel's resemblance to the Fairchild family was written on his face, in his build, in his mannerisms, but knowing and speaking were different things entirely. The system depended on this silence. As long as no one said it aloud, as long as the truth remained unspoken, the fiction could be maintained. Edward could continue as master, Samuel could continue as property, and the fundamental lie at the heart of the plantation could persist. The lie that said blood didn't matter, that family didn't matter, that a man could own his own brother, and it was perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable, until Dina asked her question. The morning of April 23, 1847, began like any other. Dina rose before dawn in the small cabin she shared with 3 other women. Mary, who worked in the laundry, Patience, who worked in the fields, and old Aunt Sarah, who was too old for heavy work now and spent her days mending clothes and watching the small children while their mothers worked. The cabin was perhaps 12 feet square with a dirt floor and a single window covered with oiled paper. There were 2 narrow beds, rough wooden frames with rope supports and straw mattresses, and a fireplace where they cooked their own meals when they had time and ingredients. Dina, dressed in the dark, pulling on the same dress she wore every day, rough homespun cotton, dyed brown, mended in a dozen places. She wrapped her hair in a cloth, slipped her feet into worn shoes, and made her way through the pre-dawn darkness to the kitchen house. The path from the quarters to the kitchen was well worn, a track through the grass that hundreds of feet had traveled thousands of times. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and growing things. Spring had come early that year, and the trees were already fully leafed, their branches dark against the lightening sky. Birds were beginning to sing, mockingbirds and cardinals and the harsh corps of crows. Bess was already in the kitchen when Danina arrived, as she always was. The older woman seemed to need less sleep as she aged, rising earlier and earlier as though trying to stretch her remaining days. She had already built up the fire in the great hearth, and the kitchen was warming, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the lingering sense of yesterday's cooking. "Morning, child," Bess said without looking up from the dough she was kneading. "Morning, Aunt Bess." They worked in comfortable silence, as they did most mornings. Bess kneaded bread while Dinah fetched water from the well, filled the large kettle and hung it over the fire to heat, brought in eggs from the hen house, sliced ham from the joint hanging in the smokehouse. The kitchen was a separate building, perhaps 20 feet from the main house, connected by a covered walkway. It was built of brick with a slate roof, designed to contain any fire that might start. The main room held the enormous fireplace, with its array of hooks and cranes, a long worked, shelves of dishes and pots, barrels of flour and cornmeal, strings of onions and dried peppers hanging from the rafters. By 6, they were preparing the breakfast that would be carried to the main house. Biscuits, ham, eggs, coffee, preserves made from last summer's peaches. Young Thomas took his breakfast in the dining room with his tutor at 7 sharp. This was Mr. Gaines's rule, part of the discipline he believed essential for a boy's education. Edward ate later, usually around 8, in his study while reviewing the plantation's account books. The routine was invariable, had been the same for years. Dinah could have performed her tasks in her sleep, and sometimes felt that she did, moving through the motions while her mind wandered elsewhere. This morning, though, she was thinking about Samuel. Her brother had been in trouble again. 2 days ago, he'd been caught near the main house after dark, where enslaved people had no business being after the workday ended. He claimed he'd been looking for a lost tool, but Horace Vance didn't believe him or didn't care whether it was true. The overseer had announced that Samuel would receive 10 lashes as punishment to be administered this afternoon in front of the other enslaved people as a lesson. 10 lashes. Dinah had seen whipping before, had heard the crack of the whip and the cries of pain, had seen the bloody stripes left on backs. 10 lashes wasn't the worst. Some people received 50, 100 beatings that left them unable to work for days. But 10 was enough to scar, enough to hurt, enough to humiliate, and for what? For walking near the house that his own father owned, for existing in a space where his presence reminded everyone of the truth they all pretended not to know. Around 8, Dinah was carrying a tray of fresh biscuits from the kitchen to the main house when she encountered Horace Vance on the path. The overseer was a thick-bodied man of perhaps 50, with a red face perpetually flushed from drink and sun and small eyes that seemed always to be calculating. He wore rough work clothes, canvas trousers, a homespun shirt, heavy boots, and carried a short whip coiled at his belt, not the long whip used in the fields for driving workers, but a personal implement he used for what he called correction. Vance had been overseer at Thornhill for 8 years, hired by Edward after the previous overseer died of a heart attack. He was efficient, brutal, and utterly without sentiment. He saw the enslaved people as livestock to be managed, and he managed them with fear. He had a reputation throughout the county as a hard man, someone who could handle difficult slaves, and Edward paid him well for his services. Vance stopped Dinah on the path, his bulk blocking her way. He looked at the tray she carried, then at her face, his small eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Dinah," he said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that was somehow worse than open hostility. "Morning, Mr. Vance." She kept her eyes deep. "Own, as was expected." He reached out and took a biscuit from the tray without asking, bit into it, chewed slowly, crumbs caught in his beard. He was standing close enough that she could smell him. Sweat and tobacco and something sour. "Your brother's getting his lashes this afternoon," Vance said conversationally. 3 by the tobacco sheds. "You'll be there to watch, I expect." It wasn't a question. When punishment was administered, everyone was expected to watch. It was part of the lesson. "Yes, sir," Dinah said quietly. "Good." Vance took another bite of biscuit. "Boy needs to learn his place, getting too big for his britches, thinking he can wander where he pleases. Can't have that. Got to maintain order. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "Your mama understood that. Ruth knew her place, knew how things worked. You do well to be like her." He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Pretty girl like you, smart girl. You could do well here if you keep your head down and your mouth shut." The implication was clear, and it made Dinah's stomach turn. She said nothing, just stood there holding the tray, waiting for him to move. Finally, Vance stepped aside. "Better get those biscuits to the house before they get cold." "Master Edward don't like cold biscuits." Dinah hurried past him, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked toward the house. She entered through the back door into the warming kitchen, a small room where food was kept hot before serving. From there, a narrow hallway led past the butler's pantry to the dining room. As she approached with the tray, she heard voices. Thomas and his tutor, Mr. Gaines. The dining room door stood slightly ajar. Dinah paused, not from curiosity, but from training. Servants learn to pause before entering rooms, to listen for a moment, to gauge the mood, to avoid interrupting at an inopportune moment. to make themselves invisible until needed. Through the gap she could see Thomas seated at the long mahogany table, his Latin primer open before him. The book looked enormous in front of the small boy, its pages covered in dense text. Mr. Gaines stood beside him, one hand on the back of Thomas's chair, the other pointing to something on the page. The tutor was a thin man of perhaps 40, with a narrow face and dark hair combed severely back. He wore a black suit, as he always did, and carried himself with the rigid certainty of a man who believed he knew God's will. Again, Mr. Gaines was saying, the conjugation, first person, singular, present tense. Thomas's young voice, hesitant, ammo. Louder. Speak with confidence, ammo, amas, amat. The morning light from the tall windows fell across Thomas's face, illuminating his profile, the sharp nose, the pale eyes, the thin mouth, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He was wearing a white shirt with a stiff collar, dark trousers, shoes that had been polished to a shine. A child dressed as a small adult being molded into the master he would someday become. And in that moment, Denina thought of her brother, thought of Samuel, who at this very moment was probably mucking out stalls in the stable, his hands rough and calloused, his clothes stained with manure and sweat. Samuel, who would be whipped that afternoon for the crime of walking near the house that his own father owned. Samuel, who had the same pale gray eyes as the boy sitting at that table, the same sharp nose, the same way of tilting his head. The resemblance was striking, it always had been. But somehow, in this moment, with the morning light falling just so across Thomas's face, it was undeniable. They could have been brothers. They were brothers, half-brothers, sharing a grandfather, sharing Fairchild blood, but one sat at a mahogany table learning Latin, destined to inherit land and wealth, ND power, and the other cleaned stables, and would be whipped for walking in the wrong place. The anger came suddenly, unexpectedly, a hot surge that rose from her chest to her throat. It was not a planned thing, not a calculated risk. It was simply the breaking point of years of accumulated silence. Years of watching her mother's sadness, years of seeing Samuel treated as property while bearing the face of the family that owned him. Years of swallowing truths that everyone knew but no one could say. Denina pushed open the door and entered with the tray. Mr. Gaines glanced at her with the blank expression white people reserve for servants, seeing her function but not her face, acknowledging her presence only as one might acknowledge a piece of furniture that had moved. Thomas didn't look up from his book. Still focused on his Latin conjugations, Denina set the tray on the sideboard and began arranging the biscuits on a serving plate. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she tried to control them. The anger was still there, hot and insistent, demanding release. And then in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear, she said, "Why does young master look exactly like my brother?" The room became very still. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse, impossible to ignore. Dina continued arranging the biscuits, her hands moving automatically, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Mr. Gaines turned slowly. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been fear. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What did you say?" His voice was low, dangerous, barely controlled. Denina didn't repeat it. She didn't need to. The question had been heard, had been understood, and now it existed in the world, real and undeniable. Thomas looked up from his Latin primer, his young face confused. "Which brother?" he asked, with the innocent directness of a 9-year-old who didn't yet understand why this question was forbidden. "Who does she mean? I didn't know she had a brother." Mr. Gaines's face had gone from pale to red. He took a step toward Diner, one hand raised, then seemed to think better of it. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his black suit. "Get out," he said very quietly. "Get out now." Diner left the tray, left the biscuits half arranged, left the room. She walked through the hallway, through the warming kitchen, out the back door. Her legs felt disconnected from her body as though she were watching herself from a distance. She crossed the yard to the kitchen house and went inside, closing the door behind her. Bess was at the work table rolling out dough for pies. She took one look at Denina's face and set down her rolling pin. "Child, what did you do?" Denina couldn't answer. She sat down on the kitchen's back step in the doorway and waited for the consequences to arrive. Her hands were still shaking. She clasped them together in her lap and stared at them, at the brown skin and callous palms, at the hands that looked like her mother's hands. What had she done? She had spoken the truth. That was all. She had asked a simple question, pointed out a simple fact. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? But she knew even as she sat there that there was nothing simple about it. She had violated the fundamental rule. She had named the thing that must never be named. She had torn away the veil of silence that allowed the system to function, and now she would pay for it. Bess came and sat beside her on the step. The older woman didn't say anything, just sat there, her presence a comfort. They waited together in silence, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up, voices calling, tools clanging, the distant lowing of cattle. After perhaps 20 minutes, they heard footsteps approaching, heavy boots on the path. Denina knew who it was before she looked up. Oris Vance appeared at the kitchen door, his face redder than usual, his small eyes bright with something that might have been anger or might have been excitement. He was breathing hard as though he'd been running. "You," he said, pointing at Dina. "Come with me now." Bess stood up quickly. "Mr. Vance, sir, she didn't mean nothing. She's just a foolish girl who don't know when to keep quiet. I said, come with me." Vance's hand moved to the whip at his belt, his fingers caressing the coiled leather. Dina stood. Her legs were steadier now, her mind clearer. Whatever was going to happen would happen. There was no point in resisting, no point in running. She had nowhere to run to. She followed Vance out of the kitchen, leaving Bess standing in the doorway, her face stricken. They walked not toward the whipping post near the tobacco sheds, as Denina had expected, but toward the main house. Vance led her around to the front entrance, something enslaved people never used, and up the steps to the wide porch with its white columns. The front door was massive, made of dark wood with brass fittings. Vance opened it without knocking and pushed Denina inside. The entrance hall was dim and cool after the bright morning sun. Denina had been in this space before, of course, but always as a servant, always invisible, always moving quickly through on her way to perform some task. Now being marched through by the overseer, she felt exposed, wrong, like a piece of furniture moved to an inappropriate place. The hall was grand, a black and white checkered marble floor, a curving staircase with an ornate banister, a crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling, portraits of Fairchild ancestors on the walls. To the left was the parlor, to T. He right the library, and straight ahead past the staircase was the door to Edward Fairchild's study. Vance brought her to that door and knocked sharply. Enter. The study was a large room lined with books dominated by a massive desk of dark wood. Edward sat behind it, his hands folded on the leather surface, his expression unreadable. Mr. Gaines stood to one side, his face still pale, his hands clasped in front of him. The room smelled of leather and tobacco and old paper. Vance pushed Dina forward into the center of the room, positioning her in front of the desk like a prisoner before a judge. "This is the one, sir," Vance said, "the one who spoke out of turn this morning." Edward looked at Dinah for a long moment, his pale gray eyes. Samuel's eyes showed nothing. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders that suggested controlled fury. "Repeat what you said," Edward commanded. His voice was level, quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Dinah's mouth was dry. She tried to speak and couldn't. Her tongue felt thick, useless. "I said, repeat it." Edward's voice remained level, but something cold moved beneath it, like ice beneath still water. "I asked." Dina's voice came out as a whisper. She swallowed and tried again. "I asked why young master looks like my brother." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Vance seemed to hold his breath. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Then Edward said very quietly, "Which brother? Samuel, sir? Samuel, who works in the stables?" Edward's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. He looked at Mr. Gaines. "You heard this?" "I did, sir, in front of young Master Thomas." The boy asked questions. He wanted to know who she meant. Said he didn't know she had a brother. Edward nodded slowly. He was still looking at Denina, his gaze steady and cold. And what did you hope to accomplish with this question? What did you think would happen? Denina didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer. She hadn't thought about consequences, hadn't planned anything. She had simply spoken. Do you understand what you've done? Edward continued. Do you understand that you've disrupted the order of this household, that you've planted ideas in my son's mind, that he's too young to comprehend, that you've violated every rule of proper conduct? Still, Denina said nothing. What could she say? That the question had been burning in her mind for years, that she was tired of the lie, that she wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge the truth. Edward stood up from his desk, walked around it, and approached her. He was not a tall man, but standing this close, he seemed to tower over her. She could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the tightness of his mouth. Your mother knew her place, he said quietly. Ruth understood how things worked. She never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn. She accepted her lot and lived her life accordingly. He paused. You would do well to follow her example. The mention of her mother sparked something in Dina. My mother died sad and silent, she said, her voice stronger now. She carried secrets that ate her from the inside. Is that what you want? More silence? More secrets? Edward's hand moved so fast she didn't see it coming. The slap caught her across the face, snapping her head to the side, making her ears ring. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. You will not speak to me in that tone, Edward said, his voice still quiet, still controlled. You will not question me. You are property. You exist at my sufferance. Do you understand? Dina said nothing, just stood there with her hand pressed to her burning cheek. Edward turned to Vance. Take her to the root cellar, lock her in. I'll decide her punishment later. As Vance grabbed Dina's arm and pulled her toward the door, Edward added, and bring Samuel to me. Now the root cellar was accessed through a heavy wooden door set at an angle against the ground behind the kitchen house. Vance pulled it open, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. He shoved Dina toward the opening. Down you, he said. Denina descended the steps carefully, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dimness. The cellar was perhaps 10 feet square with a low ceiling supported by wooden beams. The walls were stone, cool and damp. The floor was packed earth. Shelves lined the walls, holding barrels of apples and potatoes, crocks of preserved vegetables, hanging bunches of dried herbs. The air smelled of earth and vegetables and something faintly rotten. Vance followed her down, holding a lantern. He hung it on a hook, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then he looked at her, his small eyes moving over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. You know, he said conversationally, you're a pretty girl, smart too. It's a shame you don't know when to keep your mouth shut. He took a step closer. Things could go easier for you if you were friendlier. Dina backed away until she hit the stone wall. Mr. Vance, hush now. He reached out and touched her face, his fingers rough against her skin. No need to be scared. I'm just saying you be nice to me, I'll be nice to you. I could talk to Master Edward. Tell him you're sorry. Tell him it won't happen again. I got influence here. Dina turned her face away from his touch. Please don't. Vance's expression hardened. You think you're too good for me? You think because you can read and work in the house that you're better than the others? His hand moved to her throat. Not squeezing, but resting there, a threat. You're nothing, you're property, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life. He held her there for a moment longer, his hand on her throat, his face close to hers. Then he stepped back, picked up the lantern, and headed for the steps. You think about what I said, he called back. Think about whether you want a friend or an enemy. He climbed the steps and slammed the door shut. Denina heard the heavy bolt slide into place, locking her in. The darkness was absolute. The cellar had no windows, no source of light except what came through the cracks around the door, and that was minimal. Dina stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, but there was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was complete. She felt her way along the wall until she found a corner, then sat down on the dirt floor, her back against the cold stone. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself small, and she waited. Time passed strangely in the darkness, without light, without sound, except the faint creaking of the floorboards above. Denina lost track of how long she'd been there. It might have been an hour, might have been 3. Her eyes played tricks on her, showing her shapes and shadows that weren't there. Her mind wandered, drifting between memory and imagination. She thought about her mother, about Ruth's final days. The fever had come on suddenly, as it often did. One day Ruth had been fine, working in the house as usual. The next day she was burning up, delirious, unable to stand. Danina had been 12 years old enough to help nurse her, but too young to understand that her mother was dying. Ruth had said strange things in those final days. She had talked about the ocean, though she'd never seen it. That was her own mother's memory passed down. She had talked about a man with pale eyes which had taken something from her that she could never get back. She had apologized over and over, though Danina didn't know what for, and she had warned Danina, "Don't let them make you like me. Don't let them take what they took from me." Danina understood now what her mother had meant. Ruth had been violated, used, forced to bear a child to a man who owned her, and she had lived with that shame and silence for 17 years, watching her son grow up bearing the face of his father, knowing that everyone knew, but no one could say. It had eaten her from the inside, had killed her as surely as the fever had. And now Dina had broken that silence. She had said aloud what everyone knew. She had asked the question that should never be asked. What would happen to Samuel? Edward had ordered him brought to the study. What would the master do to his own son, his own brother's son, now that the truth had been spoken aloud? Dinah's thoughts were interrupted by a sound from above. Footsteps, rapid and heavy voices raised in alarm. More footsteps, running shouts something was happening. She stood up, felt her way to the steps, climbed them, and pressed her ear against the door. The sounds were muffled but clear enough. People running, people shouting, a woman screaming, then cutting through all the other sounds, a scream unlike any Dinah had ever heard. A man's voice, raw with terror and pain, screaming words she couldn't quite make out. The screaming went on, rising and falling, sometimes forming words, "No, no, please, God, no," and sometimes just pure sound, the sound of someone in unimaginable agony. Then it stopped abruptly, cut off mid-cry. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming had been. Dina pressed her forehead against the door, her heart racing. What had happened? Who had been screaming? Was it Samuel? Had Edward done something terrible to him? She pounded on the door. "Hello, someone. What's happening, please?" No one answered. The sounds above had changed. No more running, no more shouting, just low voices, urgent and frightened, and the sound of something heavy being dragged. Dina pounded again harder. "Please let me out. What's happening?" Still no answer. She gave up and returned to her corner, sat down, wrapped her arms around herself. She was shaking, though whether from cold or fear she couldn't tell. Hours passed. The sounds above gradually returned to normal. Footsteps, voices, the routine sounds of the plantation day continuing. But no one came to the cellar. No one brought her food or water. No one checked on her. The darkness pressed in. Dinah dozed fitfully, woke, dozed again. She was thirsty, hungry, terrified. She thought of Samuel, wondered if the screaming had been him, wondered what Edward had done. She thought of her mother, wondered if Ruth was watching from wherever the dead went, wondered if she approved or disapproved of Danina's question. She thought about truth and silence, about the cost of speaking and the cost of staying quiet. She had broken the silence. And now everything was falling apart. But hadn't it been falling apart all along? Hadn't the lie been eating away at everything, rotting the foundation, poisoning everyone it touched? More time passed. Dina lost track of whether it was day or night. In the absolute darkness of the cellar, time became meaningless. Finally, it might have been 6 hours later, might have been 12, she heard the bolt slide back. The door opened and light flooded in, painfully bright after so long in darkness. Dina shielded her eyes, squinting against the glare. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. As Dina's eyes adjusted, she saw it was Bess holding a candle, her face dreary with tears. "Come on, child," Bess said softly. "Come on out of there." Danina climbed the stee, Pia's on shaking legs, her muscles stiff from sitting so long. She emerged into what appeared to be late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. She had been in the cellar for perhaps 8 hours. "What happened?" Dina asked. "I heard screaming. Was it Samuel? Where is he?" Bess shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Samuel's gone, child. They took him away this afternoon, sold him to a trader heading south. He's gone." The words hit Dina like a physical blow. Sold. But hush now, that ain't the worst of it. Bess took Dina's arm, steadying her. "Mr. Vance is dead." Dina stared at her, unable to process the words. "What?" "They found him an hour ago, hanging from the oak tree behind the stables. Used his own belt. His face." Bess shuddered. Lord have mercy. His face. They say his face looked like he'd seen something terrible. Like he'd seen the devil himself. The death of Horace Vance sent shock waves through Thornhill Plantation. The enslaved people gathered in small groups, whispering, speculating, afraid. The white workers, the few hired men who helped with specialized tasks, kept to themselves, their faces pale and frightened. And Edward Fairchild locked himself in what remained of his study, seeing no one, speaking to no one. The body had been discovered by Jacob, the old man who tended the horses. He had gone to the stables around 4 to begin the evening feeding, and had found Vans hanging from the massive oak tree that grew behind the building. The overseer's belt was wrapped around his neck, the other end tied to a low branch. His feet were perhaps 6 in off the ground, his face purple and swollen, his eyes bulging. But it was the expression on that face that had sent Jacob running for help, screaming, because Vance's face, despite the distortions of strangulation, showed not pain or despair, but something else entirely. His mouth was open in WH. It might have been a scream, his eyes wide with what looked like recognition, as if in his final moments he had seen something, understood something that had filled him with such horror that death had been preferable to living with that knowledge. The county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Dawes, had been summoned from town. He examined the body, examined the scene, questioned everyone who might have seen or heard something. His conclusion was straightforward: suicide. Vance had climbed the tree, tied his belt to the branch, and jumped. These things happened. Men sometimes took their own lives for reasons known only to themselves. But Sheriff Dawes couldn't explain why a man like Vance, brutal, practical, seemingly without conscience, would suddenly kill himself. He couldn't explain the expression on the dead man's face. He couldn't explain why Vance's personal effects, when examined, showed no indication of despair or planning, no note, no settling of affairs, no indication that he'd been contemplating death. The enslaved people had their own theories whispered in the quarters after dark. Some said it was God's judgment, divine retribution for Vance's cruelty. Some said it was Ruth's ghost come back to avenge her children. Some said it was something darker, something that had been awakened by Dina's question, by the speaking of truth that should have remained silent. Old Aunt Sarah, who claimed to have the sight, said she'd seen Vance's ghost already, walking near the stables. His neck bent at an unnatural angle, his face still wearing that expression of terrible knowledge. Others claimed to have heard sounds at night, footsteps, whispers, the creak of rope against wood. Edward Fairchild ordered Vance buried quickly in the far corner of the plantation's small cemetery, away from the family plots. The funeral was perfunctory, a few words from a traveling preacher, no more. Nurse except those required to be there. The grave was filled in, a simple wooden cross placed at the head, and everyone tried to pretend that life would return to normal, but life at Thornhill would never be normal again. Within a week, Edward hired a new overseer, a younger man named Porter, perhaps 35 years old, who came with good references from a plantation in Chesterfield County. Porter was less openly brutal than Vance had been, but no less effective. He believed in discipline through fear, in maintaining absolute control, in showing no weakness. He lasted exactly 9 days. On his 9th night at Thornhill, Porter was making his evening rounds, checking that all the enslaved people were in their quarters, that no one was where they shouldn't be. He carried a lantern and a pistol, and he walked with the confidence of a man who feared nothing. He went to the stables last, as was his habit, to check on the horses and make sure the building was secure for the night. Jacob, who slept in a small room attached to the stables, heard him enter, heard his footsteps on the wooden floor, heard him speaking to the horses in a low voice. Then Jacob heard something else, a gasp, a strangled cry, the sound of the lantern hitting the floor. Then silence. Jacob, frightened, stayed in his room with the door barred. He didn't emerge until morning, when he found Porter standing in the center of the stable, his face pale as death, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. The lantern lay on the floor, its glass shattered, the oil soaked into the straw. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting. "Mr. Porter," Jacob said tentatively, "you all right, sir?" Porter turned to look at him, and Jacob took an involuntary step back. The overseer's face was wrong somehow. Not injured, not marked, but wrong, as if he'd aged 10 years in a single night. "The tree," Porter whispered, "the oak tree, he's still there, still hanging, still watching." "Ain't nobody there, Mr. Porter. Mr. Vance is buried. I saw him." Porter's voice rose to a shout. "I saw him hanging there. His face. His face." He couldn't continue. He pushed past Jacob and ran from the stable. By noon, Porter had packed his belongings and left Thornhill, refusing to explain, refusing to stay even one more night. He rode away on his horse, looking back over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. Edward tried to convince him to stay, offered him more money, but Porter wouldn't even discuss it. "There's something wrong with this place," he said, "something evil. I won't stay here. I won't end up like Vance." And he was gone. Edward hired a third overseer, a hard man from North Carolina named Garrett, and warned him about the foolish superstitions among the enslaved people. Garrett laughed and said he didn't believe in ghosts. He'd been managing slaves for 20 years, he said, and he'd never seen anything that couldn't be explained by natural causes. He lasted 2 weeks. On his final night at Thornhill, Garrett was found at dawn wandering the tobacco fields, his clothes torn, his hands bleeding, his face scratched as though he'd been running through brambles. He was muttering to himself, his words barely coherent. "The boy," he kept saying, "the boy in the stables, the eyes, the same eyes, he knows. He knows what was done. He knows they brought him to the house, tried to calm him, tried to get him to explain what had happened, but Garrett couldn't or wouldn't say. He just kept muttering about eyes and knowing and the boy in the stables." By midday, he had recovered enough to pack his things. He left that afternoon without collecting his wages, without saying goodbye, without looking back. After that, Edward couldn't find anyone willing to serve as overseer. Word had spread through the county, Thornhill Plantat. Ion was cursed, haunted, wrong. 3 overseers in less than a month, 1 dead, 2 driven away by something they couldn't or wouldn't name. No amount of money was worth that risk. The enslaved people, left largely unsupervised, continued their work out of habit and fear. They knew that if the plantation failed, they would be sold away, families separated, lives destroyed. So they worked the fields, tended the animals, maintained the buildings, kept the routines going. But the discipline that had once ruled Thornhill had collapsed. Without an overseer, without constant supervision, the rigid structure began to crack, and Thomas Fairchild, now 10 years old, had begun asking questions. The questions started innocently enough. Thomas asked Bess, the cook, about the boy who used to work in the stables. He asked old Jacob where Samuel had gone. He asked the other enslaved people if they knew anything about his mother's family, about his grandfather, about the history of the plantation. Most of them deflected his questions, gave vague answers, tried to avoid engaging with the boy. But Thomas was persistent. He had inherited his father's intelligence and his father's stubbornness. And Diner's question had planted a seed in his mind that wouldn't stop growing. He came to the kitchen often, always when Bess was elsewhere, always seeking out Diner. At first, she tried to avoid him, afraid of what might happen if she was caught speaking to the master's son, but Thomas was insistent, and gradually, carefully, she began to tell him things. Not everything, not the full truth that Edward had revealed to her in his study, but pieces of it, fragments that a 10-year-old mind could grasp. She told him about Samuel, about how kind he'd been, how he'd carved little animals from wood and given them to the younger children in the quarters. She told him about their mother Ruth, who had died of fever, who had been gentle and sad. She told him in careful language that sometimes masters had children with enslaved women, and those children were born into slavery despite their parentage. Thomas listened with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. He asked questions that showed he understood more than he should, But if a master has a child with a slave woman, isn't that child his son or daughter? Doesn't that make them family? By blood? Yes, Dina said carefully, but not by law. The law says the child follows the condition of the mother. If the mother is enslaved, the child is enslaved no matter who the father is. But that's not fair. No, young master, it's not fair. And Samuel, he was your brother. Your full brother? Yes, and he looked like me. Denina hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he looked like you. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his young face troubled. Why did he look like me? This was the dangerous question, the one Diner couldn't answer directly. You'd have to ask your father that, young master. I did ask him. He won't tell me. He says I'm too young to understand that I shouldn't concern myself with such matters. Thomas looked at her with those pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes. But I do understand. I understand that Samuel was my uncle, that he was my grandfather's son, that he was family and father sold him. Anyway, Denina said nothing. What could she say? The boy had worked it out himself, had put the pieces together. He was 10 years old, and he understood the fundamental horror at the heart of his world. It's wrong, Thomas said quietly. All of it. It's wrong. Yes, Denina agreed. It's wrong. And slowly over the course of those summer conversations, Denina watched something change in the boy's face. The innocence was leaving him, being replaced by a knowledge that no child should have to carry. He was beginning to understand what he was, part of what his family had done, what his very existence meant. He was beginning to understand that he was both victim and beneficiary of a system built on lies and violence, that his comfort came at the cost of others' suffering, that his inheritance was built on stolen lives and broken families, and that knowledge was destroying him. On the night of August 27th, Thomas Fairchild disappeared. Edward discovered it at breakfast when the boy didn't appear. Thomas was usually punctual, appearing in the dining room at 7 sharp, as Mr. Gaines had trained him. When he didn't come down, Edward sent a house servant to check on him. The servant returned with troubling news. Thomas's bed was unslept in. His window was open, and the boy was nowhere to be found. Edward's reaction was immediate and frantic. He gathered every enslaved person on the plantation, lined them up in front of the main house, and demanded to know if anyone had seen Thomas. His voice, usually so controlled, was ragged with fear. If anyone knows where my son is, speak now. If anyone has helped him, hidden him, hurt him, speak now, and your punishment will be less severe than if I discover it later. No one spoke. No one knew anything. The enslaved people looked at each other confused and frightened. Thomas had disappeared, and no one had seen or heard anything. Edward sent riders to neighboring plantations, to the town of Londenburg, to the river crossings. He offered a reward for information, $50, an enormous sum. He questioned everyone again individually this time, but no one knew anything. Days passed. The search expanded to cover the entire county. Neighbors joined in, organizing search parties to comb the woods and fields. The sheriff returned, bringing deputies, searching for any sign of the missing boy. But Thomas had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. Edward was beside him. He didn't sleep, barely ate, spent his days and nights searching, calling his son's name, offering prayers to a God he'd never particularly believed in. The plantation's work came to a halt as everyone focused on finding the missing boy. On the third day, Denina came to Edward's study. She knocked on the door, waited for permission to enter, and stepped inside. Edward looked up from his desk, his face haggard, his eyes red from sleeplessness. "What is it?" His voice was hoarse. "I know where he is," Denina said. Edward stood up so quickly his chair fell over backward. "Where?" "The old slave cemetery, past the tobacco fields near the woods." Edward stared at her. "Why would he be there?" "Because I told him about it. About the people buried there." About she hesitated. "About his grandmother, Ruth?" Edward's face went white. "You told him?" He asked about Samuel's mother. I told him the truth. I told him where she was buried. For a moment, Denina thought Edward might strike her again, his hand clenched into a fist, his whole body tensed. But then he seemed to deflate, all the anger draining out of him, leaving only exhaustion and despair. "Show me," he said quietly. They walked together through the tobacco fields, past the work sheds, into the woods. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees, casting long shadows. Birds sang in the branches overhead, oblivious to human drama. The old slave cemetery was perhaps a quarter-mile into the woods in a small clearing. It was where the enslaved people buried their dead away from the white cemetery near the main house. The graves were marked by rough wooden crosses and field stones, most of them weathered and leaning. The names were remembered only in the memories of the living, passed down through oral tradition because enslaved people weren't allowed headstones with inscriptions. They found Thomas sitting beside one of the graves, his back against a tree, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He'd been there for 3 days, apparently, sleeping in the woods, drinking from the creek, eating nothing. His clothes were torn and filthy. His face scratched from branches, his lips cracked from thirst. When he saw Edward, he didn't move. He just looked at his father with those pale gray eyes, Samuel's eyes, Edward's eyes, and said, "She's buried here. Ruth, my grandmother." Edward stopped several paces away, as though afraid to come closer. "Thomas, you need to come home. Why?" The boy's voice was flat, emotionless. "So I can pretend I don't know, so I can grow up and own my own cousins and half-siblings and pretend it's normal. Thomas Samuel was my uncle." Thomas stood up, his small frame shaking. "My uncle and my half-brother both. And you sold him. You sold your own son, your own brother's son, and you didn't even care. It's not that simple." "Yes, it is." Thomas's voice rose to a shout, echoing through the trees. "It's exactly that simple. You did it. Grandfather did it. And now I'm supposed to do it too, aren't I? That's what you're teaching me. That's what all of this is for. So I can grow up and do the same things. Own people, sell people, pretend they're not human." Edward took a step forward. "You don't understand. You're too young to understand how the world works. I understand that it's wrong." Thomas was crying now, his words coming in gasps. "I understand that we're monsters, that our whole family is built on being monsters, that everything we have, everything we are, is built on hurting people and pretending it's normal." Edward reached for his son, but Thomas jerked away. "Don't touch me. You're not my father. You're just a man who owns people, who owns his own children, who sold his own brother." The boy turned and ran, not toward the house, but deeper into the woods. Edward called. Ed after him, but Thomas didn't stop, didn't look back. He disappeared into the trees, leaving Edward standing alone among the graves. Diner, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a few paces back, said quietly, "Let him go. He'll come back when he's ready." Edward turned on her, his face twisted with rage and grief. "This is your fault. You did this. You destroyed my son with your questions and your truths." "No." Dina interrupted, her voice steady. "You destroyed him, you and your father and all the men like you. You built a world on lies and violence, and now your son can see it for what it is." "I didn't do that. I just made him see what was already there." Edward raised his hand as if to strike her, then let it fall. He looked suddenly old, defeated, broken. The master of Thornhill Plantation, who had controlled so much, who had wielded such power, stood among the graves of the people his family had owned, and looked like a man who had lost everything. "Get back to the house," he said quietly. Diner turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone among the unmarked graves, calling his son's name into the indifferent woods. Thomas returned to the house that evening, silent and hollow-eyed. He went to his room and locked the door. Edward tried to speak with him, standing in the hallway, pleading through the locked door, but the boy wouldn't answer. The next morning, Thomas emerged and resumed his daily routine as though nothing had happened, but something fundamental had broken in him. He moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, his face expressionless. He ate his meals in silence, did his lessons mechanically, spent his free time alone in his room. Edward watched his son with growing desperation. He tried to explain, to justify, to make Thomas understand the necessities of